Abraham Lincoln, the man who saved the Union, abolished slavery, and reshaped the destiny of a divided nation. His speeches inspired generations, his leadership changed history, and his courage carried America through its darkest hour. But behind the image of strength and resilience was a man tormented by sorrow, a man who battled crippling depression, endured unimaginable personal loss, and carried the weight of a fractured nation on his weary shoulders. He was a wartime president, but his greatest battle wasn't fought on the battlefield, it was fought within himself. This is the story of Abraham Lincoln, the pain, the grief, and the silent battles of a president haunted by tragedy. From the outset, Lincoln was a pillar of strength, but those who knew him saw a man constantly weighed down by sadness. Many described his melancholia, a deep, pervasive depression that lingered throughout his life. His law partner, William Herndon, once said of Lincoln that he was the most depressed man he ever knew. He could sit for hours in silence, lost in his own thoughts. He would recite poetry about death, including the Suicide Soliloquy, a chilling reflection on despair. Even in his moments of joy, there was always an undercurrent of sorrow, a feeling that happiness was fleeting, that loss was inevitable. But where did this pain begin? Lincoln's struggle with sorrow began early. At just 9 years old, he watched helplessly as his mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, succumbed to milk sickness. Slow, agonizing death caused by drinking contaminated milk. For a child, it was a horrifying experience. There was no medicine, no relief, just the unbearable sight of his mother wasting away before his eyes. When she finally passed, Lincoln's world shattered. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a cold and distant man who had little patience for emotion. Rather than comforting his grieving son, he forced Abraham into relentless labour. He believed in hard work, not education, and saw Lincoln's love of reading as a waste of time. To escape, Lincoln turned to books. He read anything he could get his hands on: the Bible, Shakespeare, poetry, not just for knowledge, but as a way to process his own emotions. But even as he sought refuge in learning, life continued to take from him. The one person who offered him warmth and protection was his older sister, Sarah. She became his emotional anchor, the only one who truly understood his quiet, introspective nature. But tragedy struck again. At just 20 years old, Sarah died in childbirth. Another devastating loss. Another piece of Lincoln's fragile heart torn away. Each death reinforced the same painful truth. Love meant loss. Attachment meant suffering. As a young man, Lincoln found love in Anne Rutledge. She was kind, intelligent, and for the first time since his mother's death, he felt truly understood. Anne was his intellectual equal, a woman who shared his passion for books and ideas. For a moment, it seemed like he had found peace, but fate was cruel. Anne fell ill with typhoid fever and died at just 22 years old. Lincoln spiraled into a deep depression. He stopped eating. He withdrew from the world, consumed by grief. Friends feared he was suicidal. He was quoted as saying, "I am now the most miserable man living. Whether I shall ever be better, I cannot tell. I awfully forebode I shall not." Even decades later, when asked about Anne, his eyes would well with tears. The grief never left him. It became a shadow that followed him for the rest of his life. Lincoln eventually married Mary Todd, a woman as passionate as she was emotionally volatile. Their marriage was filled with love, but also turmoil. Mary had violent mood swings, often lashing out at Lincoln. She suffered from severe depression and paranoia, and as the years went by, her emotional instability worsened. Despite their struggles, they built a family, but even here, death followed Lincoln. Of their 4 children, only one, Robert Todd Lincoln, would live to adulthood. First, it was Eddie Lincoln, who died at just 4 years old. Then, Willie Lincoln, the son Abraham adored most, died at 11 years old from typhoid fever in the White House. Lincoln was inconsolable. He visited Willie's crypt night after night, kneeling at his son's tomb in silent grief and regret. He barely slept. He barely ate. Mary, completely shattered by sorrow, turned to spiritualism and seances, desperate to speak to the dead. Lincoln, Those skeptical attended, perhaps hoping for even a whisper of closure. As president, Lincoln carried not only his own suffering, but the suffering of an entire nation. The Civil War was the bloodiest conflict in American history. He personally read the names of the fallen, thousands upon thousands every day. He felt responsible for every life lost. "I am haunted by the blood that has been shed," he wrote. The war aged him rapidly. His once youthful face became lined and weary. His body grew frail from sleepless nights and constant stress. His friends described him as a man worn down by sorrow. Despite the overwhelming losses in his life, Lincoln never succumbed to despair. Instead, he developed a unique way of processing pain, one rooted in stoicism, humour, and a deep sense of duty. One of his closest friends once noted that Lincoln had a habit of speaking about his own suffering as if it belonged to someone else, as if detaching himself from it made it easier to bear. He often philosophized about sorrow, seeing it as an inevitable part of the human experience. One of his greatest influences was Shakespeare, whose tragedies often explored loss, fate, and the inner turmoil. Lincoln read and reread Hamlet and Macbeth, drawn to their themes of duty, suffering, and destiny. He saw in those stories a reflection of his own inner conflict. Another coping mechanism was his dark sense of humour. Those around him were sometimes startled by the way he would tell jokes in the middle of crises. It wasn't that he found things amusing, it was that laughter was his only weapon against despair. He once said, "With the fearful strain that is on me night and day, if I did not laugh, I should die." And perhaps this was the truth. Through his pain, Lincoln found purpose. He carried on not because he was free from suffering, but because he saw suffering as a part of life itself. His own experiences with grief and powerlessness made him uniquely suited to lead a nation that was itself bleeding, broken, and searching for healing. If Lincoln lived today, how would we understand his mind? Historians have long debated his struggles with grief and sorrow, but modern psychology offers a new perspective, one that suggests his suffering was more than just personal tragedy. Many experts believe Lincoln showed clear signs of major depressive disorder, a condition marked by persistent sadness, insomnia, fatigue, and deep feelings of hopelessness. His documented episodes of withdrawal, his fixation on death, and even the accounts of his suicidal despair align with what today would be considered clinical depression. Some have even speculated that Lincoln's extreme mood swings, deep introspection, and occasional bursts of euphoria could suggest a form of bipolar disorder, though evidence remains inconclusive. But in the 19th century, mental health was barely understood. There were no diagnoses, no therapy, no medications. Depression wasn't seen as an illness, it was a personal failing, a weakness to be overcome. If Lincoln had sought help, there would have been little available to him beyond rest and religious counsel. Suffering was something he endured in silence, as many did in his time. Yet today, a leader experiencing Lincoln's level of distress might be urged to seek professional treatment. Therapy, medication, and mental health support could have changed his experience entirely. Would these interventions have altered his leadership? Would they have softened the edges of his sorrow? Or was it this very pain that shaped his vision, his resilience, and his unshakable moral compass? Perhaps Lincoln's greatest strength was his ability to carry a burden that today no one would be expected to bear alone. His story is a reminder of how far we've come in understanding mental health, but also how much we still have to learn about the way suffering shapes greatness. On April 14th, 1865, just days after the war ended, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theatre. It was meant to be a rare moment of relief, but John Wilkes Booth had other plans. A single gunshot to the back of the head, a sudden and violent end. After a lifetime of suffering, the man who bore the weight of a nation's grief was finally free from his own. As Lincoln took his final breaths, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton whispered, "Now he belongs to the ages." A tragic, yet poetic end for a man whose life had been defined by loss, struggle, and sacrifice. Lincoln is remembered for preserving the Union and abolishing slavery, but his true story is one of unimaginable sorrow and resilience. He faced depression, heartbreak, loss and war, yet he never allowed despair to consume him. Instead, he used his pain to empathise with others, to fight for justice, and to lead with compassion and conviction. His life is proof that even the most shattered souls can change the world. To ease another's heartache is to forget one's own. Those were his words, and perhaps they were his greatest strength. Like, share and subscribe for more deep dives into the history of mental illnesses.